Good evening. My name is Scott Dodson, and I am the Executive Director of the Library of Virginia Foundation. Welcome to the third of 5 Virginia Literary Awards events this year. Tonight's conversation features our poetry finalists, Bill Glose, Annie Kim, and Kiki Petracino, moderated by author, teacher, and poetry contributor to The New Yorker, Anna Scotti. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to recognize the generosity of our donors who make the library's work possible. Most notably this evening, Dominion Energy is the presenting sponsor of the 2021 Literary Awards. The Library of Virginia Foundation's work is to find the vital resources that help the library collect, preserve, and share the stories of Virginia. While the library is a state agency, much of its work, especially in the areas of education, historic preservation, and public programming, would not be possible without generous support from people like you. Tonight, I ask that you consider supporting the library's work by calling 804-692-3900 or visiting the link on your screen or in the comments. On behalf of all of us at the Library of Virginia, I thank you in advance for your support. And now to introduce our moderator for this evening. Anna Scotti is a poet, writer, and teacher living in Southern California. Her collection of poetry, Bewildered by All This Broken Sky, was released earlier this year and was awarded the first Light Scatter Prize. Anna has contributed poetry to The New Yorker since 2016, and she has been a recipient of a number of additional prizes and honors. Anna also writes fiction. Her young adult novel, Big and Bad, released last year, has received rave reviews and was awarded the Patterson Prize for the best book for young adults ages 7 to 12. Anna's short fiction can be found in various literary journals, as well as in Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine, which features both her standalone stories and her series about a librarian on the run in a witness protection program. You can read more about her work at annascotti.com or follow her on Instagram at Anna Scotti. With that, I will turn it over to our moderator this evening and our poetry finalists. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Scott. It's such a pleasure to be here tonight. A year ago, we did not imagine that we would still be virtual, but here we are. And it's a real honor to be moderating this panel of such distinguished poets. Our first finalist for the 2021 Library of Virginia Literary Award for Poetry is Bill Glose. Bill Glose is a combat veteran and former paratrooper. He carries the spirit of adventure into civilian life, having hiked 1,500 miles of the beautiful state of Virginia, and also having participated in a record-setting skinny dip. Bill is the author of 5 collections of poetry, and his work can be found in Rattle, the Missouri Review, The Sun, and other literary magazines. I've been avidly exploring Bill's work and am stunned by his ability to synthesize the beautiful and joyous with the obscenely violent. He finds tiny moments of mercy within the larger contexts of war and life. Bill's nominated collection is entitled Postscript to War. Welcome, Bill Glose.
Thank you. I would first like to thank all the readers and judges for selecting my book. And I'd also especially like to thank Dawn Greggs and George Salgado for organizing and running this event. I'm honored to be included in such prestigious company. The way in which the Library of Virginia seamlessly shifted their presentations to an online platform is a true blessing. The pandemic eliminated so many typical readings and events that shine a light on literature, and Postscript to War is not something I wanted to fade into the dark. This book focuses on an important subject that deserves our attention: the lingering effects soldiers experience from multiple years of war. The suicide rate among veterans is truly alarming. In 2018, 6,435 veterans committed suicide. My hometown of Pecoston has a population just north of 12,000. In less than 2 years, the number of dead soldiers would eclipse that population. Just imagine your town, every man, woman, and child being erased, leaving nothing but empty streets and memories. I am not only a combat veteran, I am the son of a combat veteran. My father flew jets in Vietnam. He never spoke about his war, and for so long I followed his example and that of countless other veterans by staying quiet and letting my anger and confusion fester inside. Finally, some friends encouraged me to use poetry as a means of catharsis. I wrote about my personal wartime experiences as a paratrooper in the 82nd Airborne, and I've also focused on soldiers who continue to fight in the forever war, many of them serving combat tours back to back to back to back. I wrote about the wartime experiences, the conflicted emotions, and difficulties adjusting to civilian life afterwards. Now that our soldiers have come home from Afghanistan, it is important that we realize their battle is not yet over. So I'm going to read three poems.
Excuse me, we're not ready quite yet, Bill, but thank you.
No problem.
Thank you so much. I'd like to go ahead and introduce the other finalists. Next, we'll meet Kiki Petracino. Kiki Petrosino is our second finalist for the 2021 Library of Virginia Literary Award for Poetry. Kiki is the author of 4 collections prior to White Blood, a Lyric of Virginia. Her poetry and essays can be found in literary journals such as Poetry and Tin House, as well as in the New York Times and The Nation and elsewhere. Kiki is a professor of poetry at the University of Virginia and has received a number of prizes and fellowships for writing. Kiki's nominated book is a collection of documentary poetry, a term that was new to me as I found myself immersed in her work. She has written, "Because many of my Black Virginian ancestors were denied literacy, they left behind few written records of their lives prior to the 20th century. I began writing these poems by conducting archival research. This is a fascinating basis for a work of creative art. We welcome you, Kiki Petracino."
Thank you so much. Thanks so much to the Library of Virginia for recognizing my book, and I'm so looking forward to sharing a couple of poems from the project, some of which are inspired by my work in the library.
Wonderful. We're looking forward to hearing you read in a few minutes. The last finalist that I want to introduce is Annie Kim, and it's possible that Annie Kim may not be with us yet, but she will be joining us in a few minutes. She's a busy professor finishing up a class. Annie Kim is our third finalist for the 2021 Library of Virginia Literary Award for Poetry. Annie was born in Seoul, Korea. She is a former attorney who now teaches public interest lawyering at the University of Virginia School of Law. She is the author of 1 collection prior to Eros Unbroken, and her work has been awarded many prizes and honors. Annie's poetry can be found in the Kenyon Review, the Cincinnati Review, and other literary journals. Like Bill Glose and Kiki Petracino, Annie Kim explores the past fearlessly in her work, which is intense, full of heat and loss, with erudite references that inform without distracting from the passion of the work. It's a real pleasure to look forward to meeting Annie Kim tonight. We'll start this exciting hour off by inviting Bill Glose to read 2 or 3 poems from his finalist collection. Bill?
Thank you. After World War I and World War II, after Vietnam and Korea, soldiers brought home trophies from their wars, usually one of the enemy's weapons, a Luger, a sniper rifle, a bayonet. I brought home something different, something that was oh so familiar that had morphed into something foreign, a couple of soda cans with Arabic lettering on them. And so this is War Trophies. As if it were a sport and records begged for breaking, as if mantles existed just to hold the gold cups of our glory, we sought war trophies amid the wreckage of another country. Like a plague of locusts, we raced over rock-strewn plains as foreign as the dark side of the moon. Inside back-splintered bunkers, we sifted confetti of wood and ash, blood and bone. I was just a boy who thought he was a man, feelings clenched in fists, everything I did a pose for someone else. My only mementos from that other life are 2 soda cans on the shelf above my DVDs, familiar logos of Coke and Pepsi transformed by Arabic lettering. Curious enough to catch the eye of visitors to my apartment, but not enough to make them think of war, to make them ask what else I carried home. In the confusion of war, media reports are often inaccurate. When we invaded into Iraq, we were 50 miles across the border and hadn't been fired on yet. And we paused and turned on the radio and heard BBC reports. And the BBC report said that paratroopers had jumped into Baghdad and were wiped out. And all I could think was that my mother thinks I'm dead. So this is alternate history. When we rolled into Iraq, newspapers predicted more than half of us would die. Eyes masked by tinted goggles, we feigned indifference with shrugs, joking and shrugging shoulders embroidered with airborne tabs, those narrow strips proclaiming our shared religion. Looking back on my younger self, so full of bravado and jingoistic pride, I ponder the multiverse theory of existence. On another plane, perhaps predictions were correct. My corpse rolled into an unmarked grave, then covered by a dune's shifting sand. But then, another world would provide yet another version of me, one that never went to war, never bargained with God to swing his hammer on someone else, never unleashed the black dog within his heart and set its gnashing teeth to work. And this last one, I would like to end on a little more of an upbeat note. A close friend of mine, Terry Cox Joseph, her son married into a Muslim family, and when I attended the wedding, it brought up a lot of memories and emotions from Iraq. So this is Amid the Dancing Glee. In the desert, we were warned that gunfire wasn't always hostile, that wedding guests sometimes fired AKs into the air to celebrate the new and joyous union. Like us, with fireworks on 4th of July, explosions without shrapnel or casualties, without whales rising from an impact site like smoke from a doused campfire, spurting all its steam before it dies. Intel briefings alerted us to inadvertent ways we might offend, touching a woman, drawing Muhammad, drinking alcohol, prohibition stacked upon prohibition like tears of a ziggurat, lifting our ignorance high above the sand-scrubbed earth. Years later, when a friend's son marries into a Muslim family, all I can think of is gunfire and how I shouldn't shoot back unless barrels point my way. Bearded men lock arms and dance in a semicircle, stomping as if trying to crush a fleeing mouse. Women cover heads with hijabs, wear bodysuits to conceal legs down to the ankle, their arms to the wrist. Over those, they throw cocktail dresses and lariat-style necklaces strung with jeweled flowers, striding on stilettoed heels fit for a Parisian catwalk. Goaded by ululations from the bride's mother, they dance to the duduk's syrupy moan, their sashayed rhythm and rehearsed motions as transfixing as the call and response of church. That swaddled sense of security I once felt shoulder to shoulder in a pew of congregants repeating lines of scripture. As night progresses, differences between East and West melt into night, subsumed by gleeful faces glistening on the dance floor, some covered, some not, each bathed by the light of the same North Star.
Wow. Wow. Your poems really lend themselves so beautifully to being read aloud. That was a gorgeous reading. What I find fascinating about your poems, Bill, is the spirit of mercy running through them. There's a moment in your poem, Questions Raised by Black Scorpions, that just kills me. The men have been forcing scorpions to fight, torturing them really for entertainment. And then they're called to ship out, and they stop and take a moment to free the scorpions. And I find that same kind of tender moment when you wrote, I was just a boy who thought I was a man. Would you be able to comment, Bill?
Certainly. One of the, so many memoirs of war are written by old men who forget that wars are fought by young boys. Infantry has in it the word infant, and it's kids and all the stupid things that kids do are out there. There's a job they're performing, but there's also a lot of ridiculous situations that occur that teenage boys and those just in their 20s just bring about naturally. And I didn't want to shy away from any of that. All the silly and stupid things that we did, I didn't want to glamorize it looking back years later.
Thank you very much. Before we continue with another question for Bill, I'd just like to take a moment to welcome Annie, who is with us now. She missed her introduction, but it's really an honor to have you here, Annie Kim, and congratulations on being nominated. I wonder if either Annie or Kiki would care to respond to Bill's work.
Well, I was taking note of so many wonderful images, Bill, and the one line that I wrote down had to do with your first poem, and the phrase was mementos from that other life. And I thought about how evocative that is, and how, when we're blessed to live long enough, we do remember our lives, and it's not one continuous story. It's often episodes and moments from another time and place. You know, so I really loved the way that you put that together.
It was lovely. Yeah.
Yeah, I did too. And thank you, by the way. I'm sorry I had to join late. I did listen to all of your reading, Bill. And I was curious to see what your poems looked like on the page because you read so wonderfully and rhythmically. I wondered if you had any meter in your head. Sometimes as poets, we will count syllables and think about line lengths, even though we may read them differently. So I was curious about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do have some sonnets in the book, and I have some erasure poems that have a certain form to them. But a good friend of mine, Carolyn Kreider-Ferranda, she says that you should, the way a poem appears on the page is part of the art of the poem, and I try as much as possible to adhere to that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think as a poet also, I'm going to just join this panel for a moment. I think it's really important and sometimes neglected to think about how a poem looks on the page. Most poems are read silently, and in many cases, we're never lucky enough to hear the poet read his or her own work aloud. So it's a treat tonight. I'd like to invite Kiki Petrosino now to read 2 or 3, I hope, of her poems from her own finalist collection. Kiki?
Thank you so much. I'm going to share a few poems from White Blood, a lyric of Virginia. And I started writing this book as I was doing some research into my own family's genealogy among the free and enslaved Black communities in central Virginia, in rural central Virginia. So the poems that I'll share have to do with Louisa County, Virginia, which is a small rural county in the center of the state, more or less. And it is where my grandmother and all of her family hail from. And the first 2 poems are actually take their titles and their inspiration from research that I conducted at the Library of Virginia in Richmond. A Guide to the Louisa County Free Negro and Slave Records, 1770 to 1865. The first box is for all the good white men, the ones who freed their slaves on Christmas. It's always Christmas in the first box. The day Delpha shall go out, the day Viney shall go out. These good white men only desire the guardian care of those under age. After that they shall go out, just as Winnie shall go out at the age of 21, entirely free from me or mine or any other person whatsoever. Delpha, Viney, and Winnie shall go out on Christmas Day. The first box slides open to show their certificates. The good white men of this county, believing that all men are by nature equally free, have left many of these. One certificate is for Viney, one for Winnie, one for Delpha. But these good white men can only free the slaves they truly own. One man observes, the above-mentioned Negroes are disputed in their titles to me, namely Delpha, Viney, and Winnie. He doesn't say more about the dispute. He doesn't say what happens on Christmas Day. This good white man has said all 3 should go out precisely on Christmas Day, but now it is different. It's very different now, even though Christmas has come. The good white man writes, I only free as to my right and title given under my hand. The box slides open to show certificate after certificate. It's Christmas. Louisa County Patrol Claims, 1770 to 1863. I pry open the files, still packed with liquor and strange brine. Midnight seeps from the cracks, slow pulp of arithmetic. 4 or 5 or 6 at a time, the white men draw along the Gordonsville Road, on foot or on horseback, clustered close, each man counting up his hours, the knife of each man's tongue at the hinge of his own mouth. For 93 years, and every time I slip away to read, Those white men line the roadway, secreting themselves in the night air, feeding and breathing in their private column. Why, belly up to their pay stubs, scraping my teeth on the chipped flat of each page. This dim drink only blights me, but I do it. The third poem is going to be in the voice of some of my, the collective imagined voice of some of my ancestors from Louisa. Message from the Free Smiths of Louisa County. What is it like to have a body? Like insects or velvet? We almost remember. It's why we sent you the dreams. Something green, something moving. We remember holding the rain in our mouths. We think it's like that to have a body. Furious burst of blood from the dirt, thousands of white seeds falling. It's why we sent you. The dreams keep our wishes walking. We're lonely without music to play in our hollow. You still have a body. Do you like it? We almost remember the air in this place, silk of violets, linen of sky. It's why we sent you the dreams of hanging your dress in a burned house, of dissolving into our thicket. You dream because you still have a body. Tell us what it's like.
I'm really amazed by your reading, Kiki, as well as by your work. It's very powerful, very beautiful. I love the calm presence that you have as you read your work. I think I'm wondering something that you must hear a lot, but it's a question that just comes up. How much research do you do in order to write these poems? Is each poem primarily fact-based? Is it largely from the imagination? And how much material are you taking from actual historical documents?
That each poem kind of demands a different treatment. So in the first poem that I read, I had spent a whole wonderful but harrowing day, in one of the special collections reading rooms at the Library of Virginia. And so that poem incorporates quite a bit of the language that I saw repeating as I reviewed the certificates of manumission that had been filed in Louisa County, where private slaveholders were manumitting individual slaves that they owned.
Mhm.
And so it felt important to have a lot of the language of the document in that particular piece. But
Mhm.
in the other piece, that's in the imagined voice of the ancestors speaking as a collective, that has a much more of a mysterious, oracular, visionary vibe to it. So that poem is very much written from a kind of different place and has a different energy that's informed by reading and listening and investigating, but it may not have within it any citation from the actual historical record. So each
I see.
poem feels different.
So it really varies from poem to poem, very
It
much
does,
so.
it does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder if Annie or Bill would like to respond to your work.
Yes, I would. I first wanted to mention that some of the lines, so many of the lines are just so beautiful, with like the slow pulp of arithmetic, the knife of each man's tongue at the hinge of his own mouth, and that just goes through your collection, which, since I have here, I would like to point out, we talked about the way a poem appears on the page, and the first poem that you read, where you kept referring to, the first box and taking it out, the first poem, that poem appears as a box on the page. And so that is, a perfect representation of, making the way a poem appears on the page be part of the art of the poem. So congratulations and kudos.
Thank you so
There's
much.
nothing, as a poet, there's nothing like being read by another poet.
I know.
It's
That
great.
was wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. How about you, Annie?
Yeah, I just want to respond to the use of repeated phrases. You might call it a refrain in a song or anaphora if you're using a poetic term. But I was really hooked and taken in I think in that one of the poems you read, The Good White Man or The Good White Men, that keeps coming back. And every time it comes back, it takes on a new resonance. In the last poem, which I think was one of the poems you might call more oracular, more lyrical, dreamlike, then we had some repeating phrases there too. And as someone who enjoys music and has been trained in music, I love the use of repetition and refrain as you've used it here. It's beautiful.
Thank you. Music was part of my early life too, so thank you.
I'm a teacher, and I know some of us are also teachers at one level or another up to university. This whole documentary poetry and your work in particular, Kiki, strikes me as something that students might really respond to and enjoy approaching on their own. Have you taught this?
Yes. In fact, I'm teaching a course right now at the University of Virginia. I kind of give it a tongue-in-cheek title, Thomas Jefferson for Poets. And we're using the huge documentary record of Jefferson as an occasion to practice with documentary techniques.
Mm-hmm. So are there established documentary techniques, or are you finding your own way?
It's a little bit of both. I mean, many of the techniques that you would use for any poem, such as an aphora and image construction, can be used in a documentary poem. It's just, you come to the poem from a place of having read and researched something, and there may be, real people's lives that you want to write about in poetry. And so it's a highly resonant and interesting practice.
I wonder, Bill, if in writing about war experiences, if you have had to go back and research, or if you're remembering everything from your own experience.
Yeah, so generally speaking, my process is I go from memory first and then I go to research, because I don't want the research of something to color my memory. But once I do get my memory of something down, then I go back and do the research, which I do for almost everything I write. I'm surprised at how often something will be slightly different than what I remember, just skewed slightly. But unless it is something critical, I tend to stay with my memory of it, because there is a lot of disinformation in war and a lot of confusion. And, the way that I remember things were the way that the young soldiers thought things were, even if it was turned out to be wrong.
Is that your experience as well, Kiki?
I think, yes, I think memory is important, and especially when you don't have a personal memory, but it's an ancestral memory, you still want to find a place for the poem to proceed, respecting memory and having a place for remembrance, particularly of loss and sorrow and grief, which of course is the lyric poem, the poet's realm. We are the ones who write of those feelings, those shared human experiences.
That's right.
Yeah. So I really connect with what Bill is saying.
Yeah. Well, it's time to move on to our third poet, and I've really been looking forward to inviting Annie Kim to read to us. She'll share 2 or 3 poems, 3 I hope, from Eros Unbroken. Annie?
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's been wonderful to hear all of you guys read. So I'm going to read from Eros Unbroken. And there are a number of poems in this book that have the title Eros something or other. And Eros is the god of love, although the way that I talk about Eros in the book is something broader than that. So I'm going to read you 2 poems tonight that start with the word Eros. This book is actually kind of a mix of autobiographical narrative and experiences that I'm recounting, as well as a fictional strand that's based on the friendship and lives of 2 18th century musicians. I know it doesn't sound like it really belongs together, and in some ways it doesn't, but it kind of does. I'm going to read you from the half that's more autobiographical. So 3 short poems from the book. The first one is called Bildungsroman 1999. And for those of you for whom it's been a while since you've gone to college, Bildungsroman just means a novel about a coming out into society, a moral education of a person. So it's not really for a poem typically, but I thought it was a good title for this one. It was late in the empire of concrete. Vultures liked to perch on the austere ledge outside my window, scouting the horizon. Think of angels, then think their opposite. All the things we ache to hide flung open. Soft, too soft, like a newborn barely formed. They were cold, I think. Sun dried their feathers. I was lonely, a head above a desk, ready to plunge into the glinting river called the Beltway below my office, catch like a pebble in a wheel's stainless spokes. This was before the towers fell, before the dot-com bubble burst, before Gitmo, Dodd-Frank, Frodo and the Lord of the Rings. All language to me then seemed violent, all metaphor poignant, even suspect. Driving to work, was that a metaphor? Falling asleep on the couch, work paid for, stumbling toward the bed in my work clothes, stripping in the dark, which was the old dark. The man who was my tailor, a Korean, I remember how he'd squat beside my feet, pushing pins into the fabric here and there, how he'd raise a stick of chalk, press firmly, a hyphen, a hash mark, snowy on the cloth. How he'd pause to look up from time to time and catch me standing still in his mirror, the image of me staring in the mirror. Everything is worth your look, I'd like to tell that self. Everything is still beautiful, even if you have no words to say it. The second poem I'm going to read for you has, as promised, the word eros in it. And this is a poem in couplets, which for those of you who like to see how things look, this is how it looks. And it's called Breaking Up with Eros. This morning, for example, I miss your heat, how you flare my skin into a sun, whipping my cold, dead planets into orbit. To slip beyond the body's gate, glide through its chain link fence. I need to find something beyond just the physical. I've had enough from column A. Proof you're more Apollo, less Saturn devouring his sun. Mostly, I want to be done with you. Take a match to my fingers, grip the shiny toilet with both hands, heave. Then it's night again. I'm out, walking back after dinner. The air soft as chalk on heavy paper. My pores are open, ears open. I feel the bricks of the courthouse crumbling, smell the ivy crawling across them, bittersweet. It's you I want again, your monstrous light knocking my stained glass window. Black ink of you, raining swift down dry, parched map of me, blurring all my capitals. That, at least, was irreparable. I should add that last line comes from a poem by Frank Bedart in the Western Night. The final poem I'm going to read is also an Eros poem, and this one feels timely in some weird way because we're coming off of nearly 2 years of the pandemic. It's called Eros the Contagion, but a good kind of contagion. Maybe as contagious as Delta, but not deadly. Soft as a clod painting, the yellow sky tonight. Trees in the parking lot, still thick, though the air, yes, has an edge. The honey was solid in the jar when I opened it this morning, found a single ant frozen in the dunes, stunned by sweetness. Can you really die of sweetness? Hard to say yes, though I want to, looking up at these clouds that make my heart jump. Oh, joy in seeing, though I can't touch. Like the girl repeating persimmon, as the waitress in the diner tells her about a tree at the top of the hill she used to climb. How beautiful, that vivid orange fruit was all at once. Can't touch them, but I see them in her eyes as she remembers persimmons. Maybe that was my mistake, thinking every love was different, a fruit inside its own clear mason jar. My love, her love, his, all separate as the trees they fell from. Maybe love is more contagion, bubbles in a bathtub, slowly swelling, all the little circles drifting, gliding gently into each other until they burst, until nothing's left but foam, the chime of rushing water. Thank you.
Really, really beautiful work. I loved hearing that read aloud. So wonderful. Before we talk about your work and before I invite the other poets to comment, I feel that the premise of your book is complex, and you touched on it a little bit in your introduction. But I think that if you don't mind, would you explain the idea of the book again?
Sure. It is hard. It is hard to do in a succinct way. I guess I mentioned the two strands. One strand is autobiographical, and the premise is, what if you were a middle-aged woman like me, and you were examining for the first time as an adult some difficult experiences that you had with your own family? What does that feel like? How does it feel fractured and fragmented and strange and disorienting? On the other hand, as I mentioned, I'm a musician. I'm an amateur violinist. So a lot of imagery of music came up in my mind as I was writing that strand and thinking about the body of the violin and how it's both very resonant and powerful, but extremely fragile. And so that's the one half. The other half, which kind of sprang up organically, but seems very dissimilar, is about music making. It centers around the friendship of two 18th century musicians, but primarily a historical figure, a castrato opera singer named Farnelli, who was kind of like Prince of his time in the 1750s or so. And he was a castrato, and that was common in the day because young Italian boys who aspired to sing for church or for a monarch would get castrated early in their lives. And so they were being broken, their bodies were being broken, but also for the gift and hope of music. And so I found something very compelling and resonant in their stories, the story of the two musicians who got to know each other, and found myself, I guess, a little bit in both of them as well.
It's really a fascinating premise. I thought that what struck me, one of the many things that struck me about your work was the beautiful imagery. I loved a line you had. I can't quote you exactly, but it was as heavy as chalk on, as wet chalk on paper, or as chalk on wet paper. And as someone who dabbles in art, I could really relate to that image. But the thing that I loved the most in the three poems you read was that image in the first one of looking into a mirror or going back and addressing your former self, your younger self. I thought that was such a tempting idea for a writer or a poet to delve into that. I think that's something we all maybe would like to do. And I'm going to copy it from your poem, that idea. So,
please do.
Thank you. So Kiki, Bill, would you care to respond to Annie's work?
Certainly. I like how you picked up on the chalk, because that had jumped out to me as well, where you talked about the tailor pressing a stick of chalk, I think a hyphen, a hash mark, snowy on the cloth. Oh, that just so gorgeous, so evocative. And I also like how through all of your poems, the autobiographical and the historical, there's such longing woven in throughout them. And I thought that was wonderfully done, especially the persona poems, where you take on the voice of the castrato. And so like I said, I thought that was masterfully done. And of course, I have your book too, and I implore everyone. The Library of Virginia bookstore has their wonderful books, and you can get them, and I urge you to.
Well, I think it's only fair for you to hold your own cover up too, Bill.
Yes.
Oh, and there's that one. Goes before, yeah.
Here we go. Kiki?
Well, it was such a wonderful trio of poems that we were able to listen to. And I was sort of following the imagery of transparency, translucency, and opacity. You know, you have the mirror, which is a wonderful, that was one of my favorite images too. You know, looking at the image of one's former self, which is discernible but no longer reachable in a way. And then that solid honey in the jar, I really loved as well, because that is also an image that has to do with the passage of time.
Yeah.
And longing to reach something that has changed forever, perhaps. So that's just a little thread that I was able to trace through those three poems, and they're just really luminous, wonderful images.
Yeah, very beautiful. I wonder, you know, as you were reading, Annie, I was thinking also about Kiki's work, although this question really would apply to Bill's as well. I'm wondering about responses. When Kiki was reading, I was thinking, well, this is documentary. She's going way back in the past. But I wonder if there are some old ladies in the family, the old grandmas, who are saying, you didn't get this right, or you nailed that exactly, or if she's using them as a resource. And I wonder, too, with yours, Annie, if you have the experience of familial response and what that feels like for both of you.
Kiki, do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, this book was inspired in part by the fact that I lost my grandmother in 2015. The grandmother who had all of her family had come from Louisa, and she was only about a month shy of her 100th birthday. So I was able to know her quite well, and she had been my last grandparent to pass. And so I knew that if I wanted to learn more about her life and about the world that she was born into, that I would have to do research. But I had a research partner, and that is my mom, who came with me on a couple of different research road trips that we took together as mother and daughter to Louisa in order to conduct our research. So I could not go in a wrong direction because she was supervising me and making sure that the things that I was able to pull from the historical record were resonant with our family and with what needed to be explored.
Wow. Interesting. Annie, did you want to go? Did you want to address that?
Sure, just briefly. So actually, I was on a panel at AWP last year about, I think it was called Betrayed, you know, writing about family and loved ones. So I think your question's an excellent one, and it's quite charged. It's not easy, obviously. I think that there are additional things that complicate the experience when you are a first-generation immigrant, as I am, and your parents and some of your family members may have different values. You know, their language is different. I guess I would just end by saying that, you know, poetry is real, and certainly a lot of my poetry is based on autobiography, but it occupies a different realm of the real, if you can indulge that for a minute. And it's not a literal truth. It is not. It is primarily what I've written, the experience of recounting and remembering and trying to piece together. So that was that really activated me.
And Bill, have you had the experience of getting a response from men or women you were in service with about your work?
Well, most of the responses that I get actually come from family members or someone who has a friend that's a veteran. So many of them, the thing they wonder is, will reading something like this, or if they decide to write something like this themselves, is that harmful, you know, with their to their psyches? And you know, the thing I point to is I can't think of any problem or fear that has ever gotten better from ignoring it. And in writing about traumatic experiences, you have have two choices. You can either let your history own you, or you can own your history. And that's what I think reading and writing about these experiences does.
That's a great way to look at it. You can own your history or your history owns you. I think that applies to everyone's work here. Taking charge of the way your personal history will be told is very powerful. It's tremendous work that's been shared here tonight. And I know that whether they are writers or not, our audience is interested in the process of writing. What I'm wondering, and this question is for all of you, so jump in. Is it difficult when you get to the end of a project to let go, to call the project finished and to move on to something new? And second half of that question is having a light shined on a finished book. You know, as those of us who are writers know, you finished these books some time ago. Has that affected your current work in progress? Has it taken away from your excitement about what you're doing now? I'll ask Annie to respond first, but I'd love to hear from all three of you.
It's such a great process question. And for anyone who's interested in writing or who is a writer who's watching, it's a wonderful question. I think for me, I was in a book postpartum slump for a while. I think that's very common for a lot of poets and writers in general, because I was cast about. I'm very big project, macro project driven in my poetry writing. So I felt adrift for a couple of years, actually. I was writing different small pieces toward different ends and then not being happy with them. I think I'm kind of entering more of a sustained project now, but it's been difficult. I think on the other hand, seeing the book out in the world, getting to read it, and feeling it that it's something that's apart from me, it's an artifact, has been wonderful. It's been a great feeling to know that it's still a part of me, but I can kind of let some of it go. So that has been a great experience.
Wonderful answer. I wonder sometimes, my first book of poetry was published after I was 60 years old. And I have colleagues in their 20s who have published 3 or 4 books. And I'm very curious about other people's process. So Kiki or Bill, will you jump in on the original question?
For me, I am kind of continuing the research that I started with White Blood, and the pandemic got in the way of some of the additional historical research that I wanted to do in 2020, and in 2021 we're kind of just coming back, and archives are opening again. But you know, the really great thing about history and about Virginia history is that more documents are being digitized every day and made available at places like the Library of Virginia. So what's helped feed me as a poet is the fact that, you know, on Monday I could search for something and it's not there, but on Tuesday it suddenly appears.
Wow.
And so that magic is something that I want to keep working with and have as a sustaining part of my practice, no matter what subject I'm writing about.
I see. Very interesting. We have a question here that was addressed to Annie, but I find it just as applicable to Kiki. The question is, so much research went into your work. What did you uncover in that research that surprised you the most? Let's start with you, Kiki.
I think some of the things that surprised me were the places where I could tell that what I had been taught in school wasn't the full story. So, for example, I was taught in school that every enslaved person had a first name and a last name, and the last name was always the name of the enslaver, of the family that held them. And so that's what I thought was true in everybody's case. But then as I was doing research, I realized that my own ancestors there was a whole collection, a whole constellation of last names. But when I was connecting them to the estates and plantations where they had been held, I noticed that the last names were different. And it kind of told me 2 things. Number one, that my family, my ancestors were here in Virginia for a long time and had many, many generations of history and identity during the era of the colonial era and the era of enslavement. The second thing that it taught me was that a person's name has to do with their sense of themselves and may not always refer to the circumstances of their life at that particular moment. And there may be, in my family, it could be that a name came in because they didn't want to take the name of the family that had enslaved them, but in fact had another name in the family that they wanted to use as their identity. So those were the surprising things, some of the surprising things I learned.
Very interesting. Bill, will you respond?
Certainly. So, for me, one of the things that jumped out at me was the suicide rate. That just there was the first time I read about it, there was a CNN article talking about 22 veterans per day were committing suicide, and that was just unfathomable. So that got me talking to a lot of other veterans. I've done some workshops at the VA and with some other veterans groups, and in talking to them, it's amazing how therapeutic and cathartic exploring your thoughts and feelings and emotions through writing can be. And the thing I love about poetry is you don't have to have the answer. Just asking the question is enough, just putting it out there.
Yeah. Very interesting way to put it. You're right. Sometimes the question is more interesting than actually coming up with a firm, solid answer to it, leaving it open-ended. I want to hear Annie's answer to that, but we've lost her. So I'm going to move on to another comment. All three poets. Oh, Annie, you're back.
I'm sorry, my laptop was dying, and I had to plug it in, and then I pulled out.
Well, we got a very interesting answer from Bill and an interesting answer from Kiki to a question that was originally intended for you, which is what surprised you most in your research?
Yeah, and so I tried to trace one of the 18th century musicians I mentioned, a historical figure named Domenico Scarlatti. And that was actually what drew me to Farinelli, who was his good friend. They both worked together in the court in Spain. And I guess what surprised me most was how little of Scarlatti there is in the papers and how much more relatively there is of Farinelli. So I was able to track down some letters on the recipient side of a friend of his who was a librettist in another court. And I guess the other fun fact that I learned is that Scarlatti's sonatas, the ones that we know him by today, because he wrote over 550 of them. And he wrote them on harpsichord, actually, but they're played mostly today on piano. They actually ended up in the possession of Farinelli, because Farinelli was in the same court and he inherited them from the Queen. And so it's a strange thing when you think about intellectual property rights today. Why wouldn't Scarlatti's family have had them? These are just fair copies, handwritten copies of the sonatas that had gone to the Queen and then to his friend. So that's an interesting twist on their story.
That is interesting. There's been so much great work shared tonight. The three poets are phenomenally talented, and it is really an honor to be moderating this panel. It strikes me that Bill Glose's work, while informed by the past, is set very much in the present. It's very immediate. Kiki Petracino's work, on the other hand, is very much tied to the past, even lifting actual words and phrases from researched documents in a way that is unique and powerful. Annie's work is hopping back and forth. We're here in the 21st century looking into a mirror, and then we're in the 18th century. So what I'm wondering for all three poets is, will your next work, your next collection, be structured in the same way, or are you jumping off into something really different? And let's start with Kiki.
My next book that's coming out is actually a memoir. And so I've jumped a little bit from verse to something like prose. That memoir will happen in little mini vignettes. So I'm, dipping a toe into a completely different genre. Some of the subject matter about history and Virginia will be there, but I'm also talking about other elements of my early life and adolescence. So I've really enjoyed being able to add some variation into my writing practice.
So are you exploring the process of writing this book in your memoir?
I don't know if that's explicitly in there, but each book, it feels like, has taught me how to write it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think I could have written the memoir without having written this book of poetry first. So they all kind of nourish one another.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I see. Bill, will you talk about the structure of what you're working on now?
Certainly, and I agree wholeheartedly with Kiki. I'm a generalist. I have written a lot of articles, a lot of fiction, and a lot of poetry, and I feel like each one improves the other. So that's a fantastic point that I agree with. Right now, my next book is actually a book of fiction. It's titled All the Ruined Men, and it comes out next year from St. Martin's. And it follows a squad of soldiers that have deployed numerous times to Afghanistan and Iraq, and the difficulties that they have coming home. And what I wanted to focus on in that one, so many people, when they think of soldiers, when they think of policemen, when they think of any person in a huge group, they lump everyone together as one generalized being. And I wanted to show that each man was an individual, just like each person, like each human being is an individual, and show that each of them had very different problems that they had to face and overcome once they came home.
Wow. Annie, will you talk about the structure of your?
Sure. So it's still definitely in process, but it is probably the least historical of the books that I've worked on. I'm always drawn to the past and the holes in the past and how to restructure and examine it. So this is much more in the here and now. It also has a lot of prose poems, and that's new for me, and little essayistic types of pieces. Other than that, I'm not really sure how the structure will come together, except that I think it's more unified by an imagination of the self, whatever that means. And there will definitely be a lot of references to visual art. I think visual art will be more prominent in this book than in the last one, and less so with music, probably.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting to me, exciting to me, that we're all apparently working cross genre. And working across genres, I work in multiple genres myself, and there are definite pros and cons to it. I find personally that being characterized as one kind of a writer can very much affect my ability to break in to a different form. Even within journals that are publishing my work. Oh no, you're a poet. We don't want to see your fiction, or vice versa. And I'm working, way across the board. I'm writing mysteries for Ellery Queen and poetry for the New Yorker, and I'm all over the place. I don't know what I'm doing. But I wonder if Bill was talking about one genre sort of feeding the other, and Kiki was saying that she couldn't write the book she's writing now if she hadn't already written the prior book. So I'm wondering if we can get some comments on the business end of writing, about writing across genre. What's your experience with it? And that's open to all three of you.
Well, so for a little over 20 years now, I've been a journalist writing for magazines. So for the longest time, nonfiction articles, that was my meat and potatoes. And when I would come back from that, I'd write fiction and poetry, and that would be my dessert. And I found that focusing on the articles and the deadlines that come with them uh, forces you to be certain of your audience more than the other work. And that is something that has crossed over and helped me out a lot, because you can get lost in a poem or a story without considering audience. And I think if you do, it helps give you some focus.
Yeah. Yeah. Agreed. How about you, ladies? Comments for us?
I think Kiki's probably done more cross-genre work than I have, and I'll defer to you. We'll have just a word or two on this.
Well, I'm lucky to be connected with one of the best literary presses in the country, Saraband Books, and they've been supportive of all of my projects. And I started publishing with them in 2009 with my very first book of poetry. And after my third book, there started to be a little bit of a discussion of like, what about other genres? Are you interested in writing some essays? And I had been publishing the occasional essay all along. And so then I got this great opportunity to publish a memoir with Saraband. And so the editorial experience is always wonderful with that press and with the whole marketing team. So I just feel like I've been lucky enough to find editors and publishers that want to read my next books, and that's wonderful.
Kiki, I hope Sarah Gorham is watching tonight. I hope you're working with her. She's one of the, I think, 2 founders of Saraband. And while I haven't worked with Saraband, I've worked with Sarah because we went to college together. And she taught a student-run class at Antioch University several 100,000 years ago. She was probably 18 or 19 years old. And it's one of the best classes I've ever taken. It really got me interested in poetry for the first time. So I was very excited to realize that she had become a big poobah in the poetry world. That was exciting. I want to thank our 3 finalists for being here tonight, and also to wish the 3 of them the very best of luck on Saturday, when the determination will be made as to who is taking home the 2021 Library of Virginia Literary Award for Poetry. All 3 poets are highly deserving, and it has been a very tremendous pleasure to be here and to moderate this panel with you tonight. Before we go, I'd like to ask each of you just if you would like to say a couple of words before we close, and we'll start with you, Annie.
Great. I was just going to say thank you for watching, those out there. I know that because I started my career in poetry rather late. I was a lawyer and I practiced law for 12 years. Sometime during that time, I started my interest in poetry and got my MFA through a law residency program. I teach, but I teach law students. And so my world is quite different from, in many ways, the average poet. But if you're interested in poetry and this is something you want to do, there are many routes in. So I'd encourage you to keep writing, keep looking for resources and ways to learn more.
Thank you. Kiki?
I'd like to thank the Library of Virginia not only for recognizing my poetry in this moment, but for making it possible for me to do the research for this book, for welcoming me into the archival spaces, for being there for those of us who want to learn and know and see and experience those documents and pieces of our shared past. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you. Bill?
I'd like to touch on a question you brought up before when you were asking about process and timelines, and that is that this book took me many years to write the poems and fashion them into what I thought was a finished form. And then once I started submitting it, I was submitting to the literary contests out there for 3.5 years. and finalists sometimes, but until Main Street Rag called me up and said that was the winner. So I just wanted to mention that anybody out there writing a book or writing individual poems that you're trying to get published, you've got to have a lot of persistence. There is a lot of good work out there, and you have to hit with the right editor at the right time. So, persistence and just keeping on with it. I think that is important for poets today.
Thank you all for sharing your process and your advice for would-be writers. And good luck to you all on Saturday. I'm now turning it back over to Scott Dodson.
Yeah, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. It was a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much, Anna, for moderating this evening. We very much appreciate it. This is day 3 of our finalist panels, and they've all been fantastic. And tonight was very nice as well. So thank you all. I really enjoyed it. I'd like to make one last request to our audience tonight. If they'd be willing to support the Library of Virginia, please call 804-692-3900 or visit the link in the comments on whatever platform you're viewing. And tomorrow night, make sure to tune in as well, either online or in person, because we will be having our Art and Literature Mary Lynn Kotz Award event tomorrow night at the VMFA, as well as live streamed across all of our platforms again tomorrow. And you can go to the Library of Virginia Museum of Fine Arts website to get tickets to that event. It's always fascinating learning more about arts and literature. Gaylord Torrance, who is the winner this year, who's the only award we announced prior to the awards. It's really a fascinating collection, and I hope that everybody checks that out as well. And then also make sure to join us on Saturday night at 6 p.m., where Adriana Trigiani takes us through the 2021 Literary Awards winners and finalists. And we look forward to seeing you at those events as well for the rest of the week. So thank you all again. Thanks everybody who's viewing, and I hope that everybody has a fantastic evening.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Good night.
Good night.